We're all storytellers. And honestly, the most important story any of us will ever tell is the one we tell about ourselves, right? It shapes our identity, our choices, pretty much our entire future. But what happens when that story gets stuck? When you're just rereading the same single negative chapter over and over again? Well, today we're going to dive into a powerful idea from therapy called reauthoring. All right, so let's get right into it by first trying to understand the problem that reauthoring is built to solve. It all starts with something therapists call problem-saturated stories. No, seriously, take a second and think about it. When you're talking about a challenge or a failure, or just a really tough time in your life, what's your go-to narrative? Is it a story about how you always fail, or how you're always misunderstood? Maybe how you're just plain unlucky? Come on, we all have one. And that is what narrative therapy calls a problem-saturated story. It's when one single, super thin description of you, like I'm an anxious person or I'm just not a leader, gets so big and loud that it completely drowns out everything else. It becomes the only story, and it acts like a filter, kicking out any piece of evidence that might contradict it. So if we can get trapped in these really limiting stories, is there a way out? Oh, absolutely. And that brings us right to the main event for today's explainer. This idea of reauthoring. Now hold on, it is so important to be clear about what this isn't. This isn't about that good vibes only kind of toxic positivity. It's not about slapping on a fixed smile or pretending that bad things never happened. You just can't rewrite history. And this, right here, this is the real goal. Reauthoring is about becoming a better historian of your own life. It's about going back and finding the other stories that are also true, but have been totally ignored. Those moments, no matter how tiny they seem, where you showed resilience or you acted in a way that lined up with your core values. The whole point is to thicken those threads, to give them weight and texture until they weave a new, much more complete story. Okay, so that's the what, but how does this thing actually work? I mean, this isn't just wishful thinking. It's a really structured process developed by a therapist named Michael White. The entire framework is built on this really powerful concept, what's known as the dual landscapes. Think of this as like the scaffolding you use to build a stronger, more helpful story about who you are. So let's break this down. First, you've got the landscape of action. This is all about the facts. The what. What exactly happened? Who was there? What was the play-by-play? It's the concrete evidence. Then you have the landscape of identity. This is all about the meaning, the so what. What does that action say about who you are, about your intentions, your values, your character? This is where the story really gets its power. And this back and forth is so key. The whole process is this constant movement between what happened, that's the landscape of action, and what it all means, the landscape of identity. It's this dance between the two that leads to a real transformation. It moves you from feeling like a victim in your story to actually being the protagonist. And you know what the best part is? Because this new story is built on things you actually did and values you actually have, the change sticks around. It's durable. You find an event, you explore what it really says about you, and that movement weaves a stronger, more authentic story. So, a real reauthoring conversation has a pretty clear flow. First up, you find what's called a sparkling moment, which is basically an exception to the rule. A time, even a really small one, where you resisted that old problem story. Then, you map out all the details of that moment, the landscape of action. After that, you dig into the landscape of identity to figure out what it all means. And here's the crucial final step. You connect that one moment to other times, in your past and in your future, to create a whole new, coherent storyline. Okay, this sounds incredibly powerful, right? And it really can be. But look, like any approach in psychology, it's so important to look at it with a clear eye. So let's move on and look at a bit of a clinical evaluation, checking out both its strengths and its limitations. The strengths are pretty compelling. I mean, this process can totally shift someone's identity. It literally moves you from feeling like a passive victim of your life to being the active protagonist in your own story. And because the new story is grounded in real events and your personal values, the change tends to last. And this is critical. It puts you in the driver's seat. You are the author. But on the flip side, we have to be realistic about the limitations. This process requires some abstract thinking, which can be a real challenge for some people. There's also a risk, that a therapist might get excited and try to push a new story before the person is actually ready. And maybe most importantly, this whole metaphor of being the sole author of your life, that's a very Western idea that might not resonate in all cultures. And that quote really highlights the single biggest risk here. If this whole process is rushed, you don't end up with a rich, complex story. You just get what's described here, a thin, positive story that feels totally fake, fragile, and just performative. The whole point is to build something thick and authentic, something rooted in real evidence from your own life. Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. When you look past all the techniques and the landscapes and the jargon, what is the ultimate point of this whole process? At its very, very core, reauthoring is about restoring human dignity. It's about helping someone move away from a life that's been defined and squeezed by a problem and move toward a life that's lived with purpose and intention, one that's guided by their own values. And if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. Reauthoring is not about writing fiction. It's about writing better nonfiction. It's about being a better journalist of your own past, digging up those stories of strength and resilience that have been there the whole time, and finally giving them the headline they've always deserved. So I'll just end with a question for you to think about. Looking at your own life, with all its complexities, all its contradictions, what neglected chapter of your story deserves to be told?